The purpose of our gathering here today, the Poor People's Campaign, repairers of the breach, and many of the people here who have made up the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, is that bothering you? Okay, is to declare that there was a storm before the storm hit North Carolina.
That's right.
That's right.
There were 1 million North Carolinians that were uninsured before Florence. There were 4.7 million poor and low wealth people in North Carolina before Florence. Working at a minimum wage in North Carolina, an average person would have to work 87 hours just to afford a 2-bedroom apartment before Florence. Deregulations had happened with agribusiness and energy companies, which allowed them to put dangerous coal ash ponds and weak hog lagoons in areas that were impacted, that would be impacted before Florence. And every county that was hit by Florence was either a Tier 1 county, which means the most devastated, or counties with the most needs in relative to poverty and health care, or a Tier 2 county, which is the next level up. There was a storm before the storm.
That's right.
And the only blessing in Florence is that it did not come as a Category 4, that it did not happen as a Category 3 or a Category 2, because just the Category 1 that quickly downgraded to a tropical storm has left eastern North Carolina devastated.
Yes.
But more importantly, it has left people devastated by a second storm because they were already facing the storm of poverty and the lack of health care and the lack of wages.
That's right.
Now the aftermath and the flood and the hog lagoons that have emptied and the coal ash and all of the other things that go with the aftermath of a flood leave the poor and the working poor vulnerable. And when we say poor, the majority of the people poor in eastern North Carolina are white, then black, then Latino, then Asian, and then Native. But today we don't care what color they are.
That's right.
They are God's human beings,
That's right.
all of us made in the imago Dei, the image of God. We need, and that's why we're glad for one of our legislators to be here today, for our legislature to put down partisanism
Yes.
and care about poor people and people of low wealth.
That's right.
We need a special session of the legislature. We understand the governor has called it, and so we're here today, and you will hear from others and impacted people today. And we're here to call on several things. Number one, the legislature and the government could fix much of what caused the storms in people's lives before Florence.
That's right.
Immediately.
Immediately.
And in less than 5 minutes, if they had a special session, the legislature could expand Medicaid, and 500,000 of the 1 million people uninsured would be insured.
Yes,
That's
sir.
right.
Poor and working poor people, including some veterans who would be covered by Medicaid expansion. And thousands of these persons, over 9,000 in Cumberland County alone, would receive the health care that they're going to need after this storm and after the problems that are being caused because of the storm.
That's right. That's right.
Almost 80% of North Carolinians have been
80%.
polled, and they believe we should raise the minimum wage to at least $10.
All right.
The legislature could do that
Yes.
immediately
Yes.
when they come into session.
Yes.
They could immediately increase monies for housing stock.
That's right.
These are things that could ease the storm impact. And without them, people will face a triple storm. The storm before the storm in the midst of the storm, and then the economic and health pains after the storm. People of North Carolina do not deserve this.
No.
We cannot control nature, but we can control our nature.
Yes.
We can develop the kind of human nature that cares for everybody. This legislature and governor can put down Democrat and Republican, and left versus right, and conservative versus liberal, and decide that in a special section they're going to be compassionate and care for the least of these. And it could happen immediately. We know that we are calling all over legislators, saying and others that they will receive FEMA money. That's federal money. It makes no sense to receive federal money for infrastructure and not be willing to use federal money for individual lives.
That's right.
And that money for Medicaid expansion is our money. It doesn't cost the state one dime, but it could save thousands of lives. It could give people the comfort that if they get sick because of the aftermath of this flood and this hurricane, that they could at least go to the doctors. Our rural hospitals cannot exist without an infusion of resources. And so we're calling on this legislative session and for the governor to, and the legislature especially, because the governor is there, but the legislature, expand Medicaid immediately. Raise the minimum wage immediately. Increase housing shelter. Put the kind of regulations on agribusiness and on energy companies so that future storms will not wreak the kind of ecological havoc that it's wreaking today. It's wreaking today. At this time, I want to invite, I'm going to read our official letter for the media after the other speakers, but I want to ask our co-chairs, Anna and Joyce, they will introduce themselves to come, and we have a couple of impacted persons. They will invite them to come, and then I'm going to ask our dear sister who's a legislator to say a word as well.
Good morning. I'm Joyce Hobson Johnson, one of the co-chairs for the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. I'm here with my other co-chair, Anna Blackburn, who lives in Spring Lake. She's a former firefighter, and I'll have her say some words about what we are facing and what we are pushing on behalf of our neighbors in the East.
Good morning. Good morning. Under the fundamental principles of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, we are compelled to take action, and will take action to preserve our deepest and religious constitutional values. Today, we are morally called to lament loudly at our state capitol alongside for the poorest and most disenfranchised in our community. But at this moment, especially the survivors caught in the path of Hurricane Florence. And for some, the pain is compounded as they have not yet recovered from Hurricane Matthews. There are many reasons why we should get out and vote in 2018. But I want you to take a moment and realize that for the survivors of 2 hurricanes, hoping to rebuild their lives, that reality becomes much more difficult. Why? Because in order to truly create change, and we are talking about sustainable change.
That's right.
We need our state representative to expand Medicaid, to allow affordable housing, to raise the minimum wage, to stop the cuts on SNAP.
That's right.
And until that happens, we at the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, we will continue to lament loudly and will do so all the way to the voting booth. And will continue until justice and equality is a reality for all.
Thank you. I want Anna and Joyce, both who have roots and people in the eastern part of the state, but we also want the media to know we are forwarding this letter we will read to the governor, to the speaker pro tem, to the Senate pro tem leader, to the speaker, to the minority leaders, and to President Donald Trump. Because it is all right to come and visit people and hand them a styrofoam plate with a hot dog in it and some French fries. But if you truly care about Eastern North Carolina, if you truly care about the people of North Carolina, expand Medicaid.
That's right.
Raise the living wage so people can buy their own food. Stop cutting SNAP so that children will have something to eat. Expand the housing base so people have a place to live.
down.
And put regulations on these companies and others so that when we have these kinds of storms, natural disasters, they will not be further exacerbated by the poisons and the ecological devastation.
Yes.
Maria, I want to ask you one thing. I said Maria. And I said that,
Anna.
I know it's Anna, but the reason I said Maria, I think,
It's
is
Maria.
because she's from Puerto Rico.
Yes.
And I want her just to say a word out of why she's so passionate about us doing the kind of policy things now. Because a lot of the problems at Puerto Rico came because the U.S. government and others cared more about them paying debt to Wall Street than building up the infrastructure. And it left those people vulnerable. Her mother was in that storm. You know firsthand why this needs to happen. You have anything you'd like to say?
It's imperative that we be the example of what our society, a humane and civilized society, should look like. What happened in the aftermath of the hurricane to the people in Puerto Rico is not what a civilized society looks like. And it's not what any country should allow happen to people that belong and that are a part of this country. We have people that up until today, I don't care what the media tells you, up until today still don't have electricity.
Yes.
We have people that have died because they were not able to get to dialysis, that they were not able to get across the ocean in order to get to the hospital because the hospital didn't have generators. So we see the devastation in Puerto Rico, and we now see that even some of our own people here in North Carolina still have not recuperated from the first hurricane and are now being compounded by a second hurricane, and we still haven't seen change in our state from our state representative that supports the people's agony of trying to rise, because that needs to come from our representatives
That's right.
for
Thank you, Anna.
sustainable change.
Yes.
This can be done. It has to be done. There's no excuse that it's not done. Before our representative comes, I want to invite Sister Catherine Flowers, who works on a national level dealing with ecological devastation. She wanted to be here today, is working to speak to these issues as well.
Well, I think that we have to all understand that these issues are related to climate change. And climate change impacts the most vulnerable communities first. And North Carolina has been in the eye of the storm twice with two 1,000-year events that are going to become more common. And the people that are being most impacted by this are people that are marginalized, people that are poor. And even from Alabama, I'm from Montgomery, Alabama, and I work in Lowndes County, Alabama. I could see the devastation. I have family that live in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and they're still dealing with problems there. The river, I don't know whether the river has crest there now or not, but they've had issues with trees falling. One of my relatives, the ceiling fell in on her home. And that is, I'm sure, the further east we go, the more pervasive these problems are. But I think that North Carolina can be an example. It can be an example for helping people that are in need and starting with making sure that people have the things that they need before the storm comes, so that the storm would not be an amplifier and magnify the needs that are there. So I'm here supporting the New Poor People's Campaign because I think North Carolina can lead the way. Thank you.
Amen. Yes.
Thank you. We also asked Kim Porter, who works with ecological devastation issues, to give some remarks. She's been in and out. And we also want to know the Poor People's Campaign is not just saying policy changes. We're taking food and water and cleaning supplies, but that's not enough. Private, personal charity cannot alone deal with this catastrophe. We have to have government and public intervention, and we need it now. Another storm is headed this way.
Yes.
So before that storm, the legislature ought to ease this storm and do the things that we're asking. Kim?
We're an unsettling force. And what I mean by that is we're not giving up. We're not backing down.
Yes.
We know that Hurricane Matthew was devastating. We know what happened in Puerto Rico was devastating and still is. We know what happened in New Orleans and all over the world with climate change. And we know that our politicians need to do something to regulate our agribusiness, our industrialized agribusiness with these hog farms. Duke Energy, the largest corporate utility in the United States, because they're using methane, fracking gas, and coal, which is contributing to climate change and is making our climate warmer and making these superstorms even more devastating. And our politicians need to stand up to Duke Energy and stand up to the other companies, and they need to help the people who are most impacted, who are low-income folks and people of color, who contribute the least to climate change and yet who suffer the most. And we are an unsettling force, and we're not giving up.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to read the letter and then have Representative Marcy to come, because we're going to formally give the letter to her to carry to leadership as well. What we're asking, because somebody often says, well, this is so extreme. No, it's not. What's extreme is allowing people to not have health insurance when they could have it.
That's right.
What's extreme is not raising the living wage when that could be done. What's extreme is not protecting people and regulating companies and agribusinesses, because we don't have to guess if North Carolina is going to be hit by a storm. The only thing we have to say is when.
Yeah.
It's happened too often that by now we ought to know it's going to happen, and we cannot, when these storms happen, just tell people, well, evacuate. Some can't evacuate because they don't have a minimum of living wage to afford to evacuate. We can't just say, well, we fix what's at the beach level. What about Scotland County and counties like that that don't even have shelters right now? That is not on the media. What about the people that are dying? What about the people that will die years from now and will get sick next year, who will need health care next year? We must do better. So here's the letter. Dear President Trump, Governor Cooper, Speaker Moore, President Pro Tem Berger, and to the minority leadership on the Democratic side. Hurricane Florence has devastated North Carolina and created an urgent need for food, housing, and medical attention for persons that are impacted. The North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, has joined with repairers of the breach and assisting with these efforts. However, prior to this hurricane, there was already a storm of economic injustice issues brewing in our state. Therefore, we are demanding on behalf of poor people and low-wealth people across North Carolina, more than 4.7 million, that we immediately address the chronic storms of poverty, low wages, the denial of health care, inadequate housing, and denial of ecological justice. The lack of health care, living wages, and decent housing before Hurricane Florence is making full recovery more bleak in the aftermath for white, black, Latino, Asian, and Native members of our state who live in impacted areas, for the poor and the low wealth, the working poor and the low wealth. We are calling on members of the North Carolina General Assembly to pass legislation that Governor Cooper can sign into law immediately to address these issues. On the federal level, we are asking President Trump to stop his war against the poor, which includes not only budgets that will destroy the very programs that people need now, that will cut SNAP, but also the continuing act to sabotage the Affordable Care Act.
That's right.
As of 2016, over 1 million North Carolina residents were uninsured. Medicaid expansion would have covered 500,000 of these persons and thousands in the Tier 1, Tier 2 counties that were hit by Hurricane Florence. By continuing to not expand Medicaid, our state is leaving many of our most vulnerable, low-income and working poor people without coverage. We are demanding an increase in access to the affordable health coverage today through the expansion of Medicaid. As soon as the legislature can come into session, immediately, Medicaid expansion will be a step in the right direction for the health and well-being of North Carolinians and for the economy of our state. More than 48% of the people in North Carolina are poor and low wealth. A total of 4.7 million residents, poor and working poor people, disabled and others. Most of them are white women and children. Many of these people have been heavily impacted by the hurricane. Someone working a minimum wage job in our state would have to work over 80 hours a week just to afford a basic 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. We demand that North Carolina be proactive in the war on poverty by increasing the minimum wage and by ensuring the availability of safe, affordable, and quality housing. Nearly 80% of North Carolinians, representing each party, support raising the minimum wage to at least $10.
That's right.
Many others support an increase of $15, a living wage.
Yes.
Our state legislature could pass legislation to raise the minimum wage immediately and should do so immediately.
Now.
We demand that North Carolina lawmakers establish regulations on agribusiness and the fossil fuel industry sector that will protect citizens over their profits. Our state needs to stop favoring factory farming operations over family farmers.
That's right.
And instead institute policies to prevent toxic waste from fossil fuel plants and leaking out into our environment. The ongoing flooding from Hurricane Florence has caused tons of polluted waters to spill into North Carolina's waterway. A coal ash basin from Duke Energy's power plant overflowed in the Cape Fear River. Over 50 lagoons filled with hog feces from nearby hog farms have breached their banks, spilling out into the floodwater, creating dangerous levels of bacteria. North Carolina lawmakers need to be more proactive in preventing the contamination of our rivers, soils, and rural communities with these deadly toxins that pollute the environment with every case of flooding. And at the federal level, President Trump needs to stop assigning his people to deregulate companies and instead regulate them for the protection of all of us. As our elected leaders, regardless of how you got elected, once you got elected, it is your moral responsibility to care for the general welfare of all people.
That's right.
To create policies that benefit and serve everyone in our state. In the following weeks and months ahead, as we all work to rebuild North Carolina following this destructive storm, we call on the legislature and the governor and the president. We call on you to not forget the poor and working poor. You must act now. Individual charity does not and cannot bring recovery.
That's right.
Simply giving someone a meal when they can't eat the rest of the year is not enough.
That's right.
Simply saying you pray for them when they need health care and medical attention is not enough. To say that you care for the victims of Hurricane Florence and still refuse health care and living wages and ecological protection is hypocrisy and false empathy. Let us, in the midst of all this pain, forget our past differences and come together. Let us demand an end to systemic inequality and the stigmatization of the poor and working poor. Let us put down left versus right, conservative versus liberal, and let us put forward and enact a moral public policy agenda in the next few days, now, that uplifts the poor and the low wealth communities in North Carolina. If we do this, God will be pleased. If we do that, God will judge us for not acting when we could have. Representative.
Thank you, Reverend Barber. I would be proud to take your letter, the demands. This is not a political issue. This is humanity. It's decency. We are going to be called in next Tuesday. It was just announced, October 2nd. I will take your voice of the 48% of North Carolinians to our priorities for this agenda.
Thank you.
The one bill that's been introduced so far is to excuse the number of required days of education for children in the East. That should not be our priority. It should be getting them food and appropriate education. Expanding Medicaid has been a mantra of many of the legislatures. Your voice is being heard. A livable wage must be attained. We can do this. Your voice will be taken forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you.
We are, and we'll take questions now. I want to make sure that if a child is forgiven for the days they're absent, that they have food to eat all the days of the year.
That's right.
That their parents have health care all the days of this year. That their parents have the money to provide for those children all the days of the year.
That's right.
We do not need false Band-Aids. that give the perception of caring, while we leave people traumatized by the storm that was before the storm, the storm that happened, and the aftermath of the storm. We must have a difference. Gary, if you have any questions for members of the campaign, all of you who hear us by live stream, we want you to come and be a part. Call your legislators, call the governor, ring the phones, come to the legislature next week. Let your voices be heard. Bring pictures and images from Eastern North Carolina so that we can put a face on the facts. And we call on these legislators, especially the legislators in the East. Many of them are Republican. Many of them have fought Medicaid expansion. How can you continue to have that stance when your constituencies are getting sick and will possibly die from the cause, from what is happening? We can be better. North Carolina has been first in flight. Let us be first in showing how to prevent the pain that comes from the storm. We can't stop the storms. That's at a higher level. But we can prepare for the storm. And that means more than battening down the hatch and telling people to evacuate. That means before the storm, having health care and living wages and housing and regulations. If we use this moment of pain to do better, then in some strange way, there will have been grace in the midst of the storm. But if we don't do better, we will show that even the pain and death of our fellow citizens doesn't really matter. And if that is the case, shame on us. Shame on North Carolina. And shame on our leadership. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. God bless you. Thank y'all, Anna. Thanks, everybody. Let's have a word of prayer.